Good evening. I'm Valerie Castro in for Tom Llamas. You've been watching our breaking news coverage tonight. President Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin speaking after that high-stakes summit in Alaska. The world watching on as the future of this war hangs in the balance. The two world leaders meeting face-to-face for the first time in years, walking down the red carpet, shaking hands, even laughing as they drove away in Trump's armored car. And after meeting for nearly 3 hours, a much shorter meeting than expected, both leaders hosting a quick joint press conference. Take a listen.
The agreement that we've reached together will help us bring closer that goal and will pave the path towards peace in Ukraine.
But we had an extremely productive meeting and many points were agreed to. There are just a very few that are left. Some are not that significant. One is probably the most significant. But we have a very good chance of getting there.
Both presidents calling the meeting productive, but remaining vague on what was agreed upon. The press conference lasting only a few minutes, with the leaders notably taking no questions. With what was accomplished today unclear, the stakes couldn't be higher for President Trump, who campaigned on a promise to end this war, calling himself the, quote, deal maker in chief. But notably not at today's meeting, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, not invited to the summit, but rallying support from European leaders in recent days. Amid these talks of peace, missile strikes continue to rain down in Ukraine and Russia. This 3.5-year-long war leaving hundreds of thousands of people dead. This is the state of play in Ukraine. Russia making significant advances in the southern and eastern parts of the country. A big question tonight, will these contested regions be up for grabs after today's conversations? We're following it all tonight from Alaska to Ukraine as the world waits to learn more about what really happened behind closed doors. Joining us now from inside the room where this press conference happened is NBC News senior White House correspondent Peter Alexander. Peter, what more have we learned, if anything, about what this agreement, what was made of this agreement that they're touting? What does it actually entail?
Yeah, Valerie, very little, to be honest, which is striking in its own right. We haven't even heard really the sort of post-summit spin from some of the president's top advisors right now. Certainly what we do know is that both Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump are now leaving Anchorage, it appears, without declaring any ceasefire, which the President Trump himself had indicated was his top priority. Only a matter of hours ago, earlier today, aboard Air Force One, saying he was not going to be happy if they did not have a ceasefire by day's end. There is really very little clarity on what was achieved here. The president said, we don't have a deal until we have a deal. They didn't say specifically what, if any, agreements were made as it relates to Ukrainian land, to Ukraine's territory. But there was perhaps a problematic indication from Vladimir Putin, who said, among other things, he said that we're convinced that in order to make settlement lasting and long term, we need to eliminate all of the primary causes of the conflict, repeating a phrase that he and other Kremlin officials have used for quite some time, in effect blaming Ukraine for this war. It doesn't appear that Vladimir Putin is any closer to accepting an independent and sovereign country, Ukraine, to be its neighbor. Donald Trump, notably, who has held tons of news conferences in both of his terms, but this may go down as the shortest, where he spoke for a total of only 3.5 minutes, deferring to his guest, Vladimir Putin, to speak first, not taking any answers from reporters. I will pull back the curtain a bit, Valerie, and tell you a bit what struck me in this room right now. It did appear that some of the president's top aides, as they arrived here, Steve Witkoff, Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary, did appear a bit stressed out as they arrived shortly after the meeting took place. There was one other sort of telling indication with Marco Rubio joking a bit with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister from Russia, in the front row. But what either side left with, Vladimir Putin can claim that he left with a win, in effect. He got the photo op that critics said he wanted. He got no ceasefire that he has been trying to avoid, and he also avoids more sanctions that Donald Trump had said would go into effect a week ago today. That was supposed to be deadline day. Now it doesn't appear that those sanctions will be slapped on Russia. So Vladimir Putin leaves, heads home with, in the eyes of many of his critics, basically what he was looking for. Valerie?
And Peter, you touched on this. Coming into this meeting, Trump was almost escalating his rhetoric, saying he wouldn't be happy if there wasn't a ceasefire, saying he might walk out, threatening some consequences. We finally get here. We see this friendly greeting on the tarmac, the shaking of hands. The White House posted a photo on X, the president beaming, standing next to Putin before the meeting. And then we have the bilateral press conference. Both sides showered praise on each other. Putin referring often to our dear neighbors. Why was there such a disconnect between what we were hearing before the meeting and then what we actually saw at the meeting?
Well, that's a question I think we want to get from the White House itself. I mean, the president has said he set the bar for himself. He said he'd be willing to leave if progress wasn't made, if things went south, if there, in effect, was no ceasefire. That's what he said just today, and it looks like he's going home without one. You know, what was really striking, Valerie, for those of us in attendance here was just the dramatic sort of scene, the pageantry, the images that we're going to leave this summit having witnessed. Donald Trump and President Putin both descending the stairs of their planes almost simultaneously, walking the red carpet together. In many ways, it felt like Donald Trump had produced not just his presidency, but certainly this moment, the two shaking hands in the eyes of Russian media. It lasted for 15 seconds in total between two separate handshakes before they greeted each other again, standing atop a podium there, a platform there surrounded by American fighter jets, warplanes flying overhead. And then, perhaps most remarkably of all, Vladimir Putin joined Donald Trump inside the presidential limousine, the beast, for approaching 10 to 15 minutes. The White House has said there was going to be no one-on-one meeting between the two, that there would be only a 3-on-3 meeting taking place ultimately. But for that period of time, the two were alone together, no note takers, no interpreters, leaving much of the world wondering what, if anything, was discussed in the course of that time. Valerie?
Peter, right now we're taking a live look at the joint base where Putin and Trump arrived earlier today. It appears that Putin's aircraft is still there on the ground. Air Force One is also there off to the right, as I can see. What happens next? We know the president didn't take any questions at the press conference. Could he answer any questions on the flight home?
It's a good question. We don't know. Donald Trump had initially scheduled an interview with what has been one of his favorite megaphones, Fox News, for later today. Sean Hannity was in attendance. Another Fox anchor had traveled aboard Air Force One with the president when he came here. If that's taking place, we don't know yet, but it might be an opportunity for a bit more clarity about what, if anything, occurred here. The president has said among his top priorities right now, conversations with Volodymyr Zelensky, with the Ukrainian leader, with the European leaders, about what, if anything, in terms of progress was made, what was discussed, and where they go from here. As you speak about the president and his plans for going forward, remember the president had said that he thought the easiest way to address this war was for everyone to stay here and to bring Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, here to try to come to some peace deal, to try to come to some ceasefire. Well, it appears clear that that is not going to happen right now, as they may have made some progress, but certainly didn't get significantly closer to a ceasefire. So for the president, he has some calls to make, some discussions to have, but the bottom line for many people, it means that the war in Ukraine continues unabated.
All right, Peter, we hope that you can stand by for us. We may come back to you with some more questions. But for now, let's bring in our chief international correspondent, Keir Simmons, who has interviewed Putin multiple times. Keir, given your knowledge of Putin, having sat down with him, after hearing what he had to say, do you think today was a win for him?
Well, I think that it was. I don't know whether he will view it that way. I thought his face was interesting after he made his comments. There weren't the smiles and the laughs that you saw at the beginning in the Beast, the presidential car, as he sat with President Trump. It was fairly stony-faced, fairly sour-looking, I would say. Now, that might just be President Trump, President Putin. He can be like that. But that being said, I think the fact that this lasted for 3 hours, where the Kremlin had suggested it could go for 6 or 7 hours, the fact that President Putin brought all of these officials with him, including trade negotiators, in the middle of the Russian vacation time in August, important to Russians, even to Russian officials, he took them around the world for what, in the end, ended up being a meeting between a small number of officials and nobody else, the others having to just sit in the front row there as that short news conference took place. I mean, I think that we can read that one way. Now, it is possible, and I think that the Russians, as well as the Trump administration, will be briefing now and will be preparing to talk to their own journalists, the Russians, and get their story out, if you like. I think it's possible that details emerge that suggest that things have moved further than that news conference suggested, and maybe President Trump needs to have some conversations with the Europeans and the Ukrainians. All of that is possible, but what we didn't see there, did we, was President Trump and President Putin walk out and say, OK, we've agreed a ceasefire, maybe even a temporary ceasefire. We did hear President Putin say once again that the important thing to him is the, as he calls them, the root causes of the war in Ukraine, by which he means all of the things that he has talked about for years, like the expansion of NATO, all of these geopolitical questions that he has about the way the West has behaved. That's the kind of thing that's going to go nowhere, because in the end, NATO is not going to kind of step back in order to appease President Putin. Certainly not now, after the war in Ukraine. So Peter Alexander, at the end of his comments there, I thought made the most impactful point, which is the war continues. There will be more deaths. We are still a long way from an agreement. And remember that on both the Trump administration side and the Kremlin side, there are officials who are going to want to paint this as positive. And that's the version they will be spinning, if you like. But actually, we don't have an end to the war. And one other point, and it's an important one that Peter, just to reinforce, that Peter made, is that what we also didn't, though, hear from President Trump was, OK, we haven't got a deal, so therefore I'm going to impose tariffs and more sanctions on Russia. Therefore, I'm definitely going to impose 50% tariffs on India for buying cheap Russian oil. Therefore, I'm going to lean into strategic support for Ukraine. We didn't hear any of that just a week after he set a deadline where he said he would do those kinds of things if President Putin didn't agree to a ceasefire.
Here we now have all these extraordinary images of President Trump greeting Putin warmly on the red carpet, laughing, shaking his hand, having this press conference. You mentioned earlier today those are images that we will be talking about for weeks, if not months or longer. Do those images and events this evening play to Putin's advantage?
Yes, because in Russia, already, the Russian state media is portraying those images as a sign that President Putin is on the world stage, that he is equal to the American president, that he has a great relationship with President Trump. So if the outcome of all of this, and again, even though we just had the news conference, there's more to come, there's more reporting to come. But if the outcome of all of this is this continuing kind of bonhomie between President Trump and President Putin, without any real agreement, President Putin, at least tactically, takes a win from that. He can continue his war, which many believe he quite likes. And he can continue to pursue what he thinks is the possibility that the Ukrainian front line will collapse, even if that may not be true. That may be what President Putin thinks. So he has managed, if that's the case, to shift the American president from an ultimatum to an agreement to keep talking.
We know President Trump referenced in that press conference that he had some phone calls to make after this meeting, potentially to Zelensky. Keir, ending this war has been more challenging for the president than he anticipated. We don't have a lot of details yet. Do you think he might be making that phone call now? And do you think any of the work done today moves us closer to the end of the war?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I imagine that he is making those phone calls. He does appear to have, if you like, stuck to the script. There was an enormous amount of diplomacy by the Europeans and the Ukrainians, sophisticated diplomacy to get President Trump back towards the position that the Europeans and the Ukrainians have held, that, things like you can't agree territory without Ukraine being involved in those negotiations. So that conversation will be being had. And from that perspective, the Europeans and Ukrainians will think that it is positive. But again, what they don't have is an end to the war. What they don't have is President Putin saying, OK, I realize this is going nowhere and I'm going to make some serious concessions, some serious compromises. That's not what President Putin just said in that news conference. To make an obvious point, ending a war is incredibly hard. And I mentioned earlier in the day that even whatever came out of this summit, that it would still be a process, and it still will be. Even if there's a ceasefire, ceasefires can collapse. You try to get a ceasefire in order to be able to negotiate, in order to get a permanent ceasefire. All of that is a process. So we're still in the process. Unfortunately, it is a process that may well last a lot longer, despite President Trump's promises that it could be ended quickly. And by a lot longer, I mean it's feasible. It's still possible to imagine that this war continues for years.
Chief International Correspondent Keir Simmons. Keir, thank you so much for your time. To break down more of what we heard from President Trump and Russian leader Putin and what it means for Ukraine, I want to bring in two men who know the region well. Wesley Clark, retired U.S. Army general and former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, and Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor to former President Obama and an NBC News political contributor. Thank you both for being here. General Clark, I want to start with you tonight. It's really unclear exactly what was accomplished at this meeting. What are your takeaways from all of this?
Well, I think President Putin gave some kind of an outline for what he wants in a ceasefire. And so by doing that, I think he forestalls President Trump imposing the serious consequences. And I think now President Trump indicates he's going to go to the Europeans and the Ukrainians to see about it. But what I'm very worried about is two things. Number one, President Putin continued to emphasize, let's get to the root causes, the root causes. Well, we know what he believes the root causes are. The root causes are NATO. It's freedom and democracy in Eastern Europe, and especially it's Ukraine's efforts to be an independent state aligned with the European Union. These would all be root causes of national insecurity for Mr. Putin. And so he hasn't given up on any of that. And so it's unlikely that this proposal is going to go anywhere. But I think President Trump did what he said he was going to do. He didn't get distracted into, so far as we can tell, a long economic discussion, U.S. bilateral relations with Russia, strategic arms negotiations. Seems like he stuck to his guns on this. That's why it was short. But if I were in Ukraine, I'd be very worried that pressure is going to be applied by the United States to somehow go along with what Mr. Putin has proposed.
And to that point, Ben, let's talk about what Ukraine just heard or didn't hear in this announcement from Trump and Putin. What do you think President Zelensky is thinking right now?
He's probably not surprised. I mean, I agree with General Clark that the thing about Putin's positions is they have not changed at all over the course of the war and certainly over the course of the 7 months of the Trump administration. He wants recognition internationally of the 20% of Ukrainian territory that Russia occupies and has tried to formally annex. He wants a pledge that Ukraine will never be in NATO, and probably even beyond that, that Ukraine can align itself by joining the European Union either. And, you know, he essentially wants to dictate the terms on which the war ends. And there's no reason to believe that those positions have changed. So I think the only drama out of this meeting today is, would President Trump essentially just capitulate and accept those terms and try to dictate them on President Zelensky? And the White House has made pretty clear that they weren't going to do that there's going to be a more extended process here. Or would Putin perhaps accept some short-term temporary ceasefire? And that's why it's important that President Putin, reiterated what is not a surprise, that he wants to address the, quote, root causes of the conflict. He doesn't want a short-term ceasefire. He believes he has the advantage on the front line. He believes he has the advantage in a war of attrition. He believes he's not only grinding Ukraine down militarily, he believes he's grinding down the unity between the United States and Europe and Ukraine because he is. And so the question here is whether there's anything more to these proposals that both leaders referenced, whether that's progress in their mind that has to be taken to the Europeans and the Ukrainians, or whether it's simply still a gap between those positions. If I'm President Zelensky, what I'm most focused on is making sure that Trump just doesn't take the Putin plan and try to impose it on me. And what he's done, President Zelensky, is he's lined up the Europeans behind that position. And he's gotten Europeans to repeatedly, and in a unified way, often in more than one leader at the same time, getting on the phone with Trump, saying, we're aligned behind this position. Don't agree to what Putin's saying. It's a trap. And we'll see whether in Trump's eagerness to get some kind of win here, he starts twisting arms in Europe and Ukraine to pull them in the direction of Putin, or we'll see whether there's some kind of rupture between Trump and Putin. We just don't know enough to know where this is going at this point.
General Clark, Putin and Trump both saying there was progress. Putin saying these negotiations were constructive, but of course no ceasefire was publicly announced. What other kinds of progress could that mean?
Well, I think he's touting the fact that President Putin didn't say flat no. But Valerie, stand back for a second. When's the last time an American president didn't say that we believe in democracy, that liberty, that nations have a right to set their own course? Why is it that General Keith Kellogg was excluded from the delegation because he's for Ukraine? Aren't Western nations for Ukraine? If that's the case, why wouldn't we exclude from the negotiations people who are for Russia? So I think there's a very strange way that the president has set this up, as though the United States can't help Ukraine too much, because then Mr. Putin won't like it. Now, contrast this with President Eisenhower ending the war in Korea in 1953. He simply said, stop it. And he sent an atomic cannon to South Korea to get the message across to China and North Korea. He didn't say, gee, this is a real terrible war. Thousands of people have been killed. Let me be neutral and see what I can do. He was clearly on the side of freedom, democracy, and so forth. So I think we have to look at the overall framing of this issue to see why it's going to be difficult for the president to put the pressure he needs to put on Mr. Putin to get a resolution short of something that is really adverse to Ukraine, to Western democracy, to NATO, and to Europe.
And Ben, you have experience with these types of high-stakes, high-level meetings. What do you make of the way Trump and Putin characterize this meeting? Is there a strategy to providing so few details up front? Was the president trying to manage expectations?
Well, look, let's just say something about President Putin's strategy. President Putin's strategy came off wonderfully. He wants to show that he's come in from the cold, right? A couple of years ago, he was totally diplomatically isolated, certainly in the West. Now here he is, literally getting a red carpet rolled out for him
some live pictures,
in the United States of America.
Live pictures of the tarmac of a motorcade pulling up to what appears to be Putin's aircraft, I believe, a motorcade with flags there. Yes, that appears to be him preparing to board the plane. Ben Rhodes and General Wesley Clark, thank you so much for your time. Amid the summit in Alaska, the war in Ukraine continues. Many in the country were not optimistic. Let's head to Richard Engel. Richard, early hours there in Ukraine. What can you tell us?
So I'm in the city of Kharkiv, and just moments ago, just as that press conference was ending, that sort of inconclusive press conference here in Kharkiv, we heard the air raid sirens go off. We didn't hear them going off throughout the summit, but perhaps on cue, we heard them a short while ago, and those are an indication that there's a Russian drone or missile attack in and around this area.
Cut you off, but just want to reference these live pictures. Hate to cut you off, but want to reference these live pictures of Vladimir Putin going up the steps to his aircraft, giving a short wave, and entering the plane. There again, live pictures of Putin getting ready to leave the joint base there in Alaska. Richard, just to mention earlier, we saw all those images earlier today of these leaders shaking hands, Putin seeming to laugh inside the car with President Trump. What do you think Ukrainians will make of those images?
Well, Ukrainians were talking about them. The news here, television news, was talking about that, and the warmth that seemed to be on display between President Trump and President Putin. And nobody here missed the fact that when President Zelensky went to the White House earlier this year, he was treated quite badly, and his meeting was cut short, and his clothing was insulted, and he was questioned why he hadn't been thanking President Trump enough, and didn't get this kind of red carpet reception. But aside from that, Ukrainians were much more nervous going into this meeting than perhaps many people realized. Ukrainians are watching the future of their country play out. They don't know how this war is going to end, what happens to the 20% of their territory that is currently held by Russia. There is a mass mobilization effort underway right now that means at any time of the day or night, Ukrainian military-aged males can be taken from the street and sent to the front lines. This is a difficult time. This country is at war. The Russians are on the offensive. And what Ukrainians were worried is that President Trump and Vladimir Putin today were going to unilaterally make an announcement about a ceasefire, about a peace deal, and that Ukrainians would be left to deal with it, left with the consequences, whether they liked it or not. Instead, we saw a process. We saw these two leaders, President Trump and Vladimir Putin, meeting. Of course, they would meet in a cordial way. President Trump did invite him to come to the United States. After all, it would be surprising if he treated him badly. And now, as President Zelensky had been asking President Trump, President Zelensky and European leaders asked President Trump just a few days ago, have this meeting, set up a future meeting, involve us in the process, don't go too fast, don't fall for Vladimir Putin's lies and promises, and keep the process going so that Ukraine, Europe, the United States, and Russia can reach what Ukrainians believe would be and Europeans believe would be a long-term successful peace deal, not a short win that could lead to more deaths down the road. So the best news that Ukrainians could have heard tonight would have been that Vladimir Putin said that he was packing up his troops and leaving the country and that he was giving up on the war. That was never in the cards. But another alternative that did seem possible didn't happen, which is that Vladimir Putin and Trump unilaterally made a decision about Ukraine without involving the Ukrainians.
Richard Engel, live for us tonight from Ukraine. Richard, thank you. For more on the perspective from Ukraine, which of course was sidelined from these talks, I want to bring in Andrei Dobraevsky, a spokesman for the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America and chair of UN Affairs at the Ukrainian World Congress. Andrei, it's the middle of the night in Ukraine right now, where Richard is. When Ukrainians wake up, what will they make of what happened here today?
Well, unfortunately, as we just heard, many Ukrainians didn't get to sleep tonight. A lot of Ukraine was under air attack tonight. It wasn't just in the Kharkiv Oblast where we just saw, but it was most of Ukraine. Actually, half of Ukraine was under air raid alert tonight. So you don't get to sleep in Ukraine. And certainly President Trump and his team knew that this was happening, knew that whether Kharkiv was attacked or other cities, knew that there were active strikes happening while they were talking, and Putin simply let it happen.
Andrei, we want to show a split screen here between the way Zelensky and Putin have been treated by Trump. Today we saw Putin's red carpet rollout, shaking hands, smiling with Trump, smiling as he rode with Trump in the Beast. The meeting with Zelensky earlier this year was a complete 180. That picture almost admonishing Zelensky. Trump calling this meeting productive. But what do you think Ukrainians will take away from these images, these very striking images, and the differences between them and the way the Russian leader was greeted today?
I was live on Ukrainian television when they came off their planes. There was a lot of questions from the reporters. What's happening? And then we saw the picture of the room with pursuing peace. Questions like, well, what are you pursuing? The war criminal is right there. What is left to pursue? So there's going to be a lot of questions. Today was it's the middle of the night, but earlier it was a church holiday in Ukraine. Ukrainians being left out of the conversation took to faith today. Everything was out of their control. Prayers for intercession for the Feast of the Dormition. Maybe the Virgin Mary, Mother of God, can intercede on our behalf. But beyond that, tomorrow is another work day. Get up. work out 3 or 4 possible plans, address different European leaders, address President Trump, and get back onto the negotiating table. Because what happened today was clearly a President Putin event, not a President Trump event.
And despite what happened today, the war in Ukraine continues. We know that just today Russia was striking a central market with drones. What does that signal to you? Is Russia serious about a ceasefire? And did Ukrainians hold out any hope that would be the outcome of today's meeting?
The United States is currently, with Steve Witkoff and others, negotiating with 3 terrorist states. They're negotiating with Hamas, they're negotiating with Iran, and they're negotiating with Russia. Neither of these entities are willing to put a ceasefire so you can sit across from somebody and talk about a just peace. So this is the problem for the United States and the world when they say that they need to come to a deal. There's no deal to be made. There's a war criminal. He's wanted for crimes of stealing children. And President Trump didn't even accomplish that today. There were 400 names given to the Russians after President Trump asked Ukraine and Russia to sit down in Istanbul. 400 names of children passed over. Not a single one of those has been addressed by Russia in 8 weeks since that time. So this is the problem with the situation. It's not just the ceasefire, but it's the entire war crime of this. This is why Ukraine is pushing for a just peace, not just a ceasefire.
Andrei Dobrinsky, thank you so much for your time. We want to take you back to these live images from the joint base there in Alaska. You see Leader Putin's plane there. We saw him go up the steps earlier after arriving in his motorcade. Unclear if President Trump is still on the ground there, but there you see the Russian plane that will head back. You've been watching Top Story with today's special coverage, President Trump's historic summit with Russia's Vladimir Putin wrapping up after nearly 3 hours. More questions and answers tonight. Don't go away. More news continues.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.